I'm Bryan Simmons. I am the CEO and owner of Behavioral Education Systems and Technologies. I've been a behavior analyst for a number of years here in Southern California. My company specializes and emphasizes in pairing compassionate care with an evidence-based approach. And so it's really important that we emphasize the human nature and human quality that goes into what we do with behavior analysis, making sure we put our clients first. I'm really big on focusing on preventative strategies and taking a functional approach with folks that we work with and care for. So preventative strategies are also known as antecedent-based interventions. So these are the types of interventions and strategies, techniques that we employ in behavior analysis to take advantage of catching behaviors before they have an opportunity to occur. And so before the clients, the patients, the students have an opportunity to engage in unwanted or undesired behaviors, we try to preempt them by engaging or taking advantage of these preventative strategies. That way behaviors can be prevented, not avoided, prior to them actually becoming an escalation or a big behavior like a tantrum. So some examples of preventative strategies are things called priming, pre-max principle, pre-teaching, visual supports, environmental arrangement, shared control, establishment of a reinforcer, and there's also functional communication training. Pre-teaching, for example, is a strategy that involves teaching a student or a child a concept or skill prior to that lesson on that particular subject. An example of that might be, or maybe elaborated upon, could be a skill that I'm going to teach them before they're put in a circumstance or a situation where they would have to exhibit that skill, as opposed to having them approach that opportunity or that circumstance and expecting them to know what to do in that situation. And then when an escalated behavior begins, then trying to teach them that skill. You want to try to, again, preempt them by teaching them ahead of time, so that way we can get that practice in while they're nice and calm, de-escalated in a calm state before they get put in that sort of circumstance. So an example of that might be a coping skill. So if I know in advance that a child, historical data, have a difficult time with working on, say, an academic activity, what I might do is teach them how to ask for help, or teach them how to cope with a frustrating situation before they get presented with, say, that academic activity that has historically or traditionally escalated them into a tantrum. So I might sit with them and do some role play with them and teach them what a coping skill is, what a coping skill looks like, how I use coping skills in my life when I encounter frustrating and agitating situations. Similarly, with asking for help, for example, could be another form of a coping skill, but it also could be an important skill to pre-teach. So instead of becoming escalated and going into a tantrum, I could teach them how to effectively ask for help or some form of support or assistance with that academic activity or frustrating event prior to them becoming escalated. A visual support could be another preventative strategy or antecedent-based intervention. A visual support could come in the form of token autonomy systems. It can come in the form of a visual schedule with activities kind of laid out ahead of time. A visual support could also come in the form of a task analysis or kind of a step-by-step method with different steps broken down for a particular task. For example, tying shoes, washing my hands, maybe even a recipe. I can have those things broken down. Another form of visual support could even be a timer. So like we all have our phones these days, a timer could be a very good visual support to use with the children that we work with. So environmental arrangement is just the way that we situate an environment ahead of time or a setting ahead of time that's most conducive to safety while also mitigating maladaptive behaviors. So for example, if I know a student or a child has a tendency to elope, I might sit myself in between them and the closest exit. So that way I'm not chasing them because they were closer to the exit, but rather I'm giving them an opportunity to ask me to maybe move out of the way or asking me to leave the particular area. So sitting myself or situating myself in between them might be an example of environmental arrangement. Or for example, if I know they have a tendency to engage in property destruction and throwing of objects, I might clear a particular desk area or table area prior to sitting at that area. So that way they're less likely to throw things because the table's been cleared of any sort of clutter. So functional communication training is just a replacement skill or strategy that we use that helps replace interfering behavior with communicative attempts. Basically giving those communicative attempts, those skills to a child or a student ahead of time. So teaching them how to ask for help before they have to ask for help. Teaching them how to ask to leave a particular area if they need to leave before they need to leave. So teaching them and giving them the verbiage or the vocalizations that they would need to use in a particular situation before the time comes that they would have to actually use that skill. Priming is just an example of preparing a child or a student ahead of time. You can think of priming as giving like a heads up. Hey, just so you know, in a few minutes, we're going to be starting our math. Just so you know, in about 3 more minutes, we're going to be done with YouTube video. So you know, in 60 seconds, we're going to be getting ready for bed. Those can all be examples of priming. And you can pair those really nicely with things like visual support. So for example, using your timer would go really nicely with priming. Pre-max principle is less preferred and then high preferred. So oftentimes people will word it as first then, but it's important to keep in mind when you're using the pre-max principle that you're taking advantage of the less preferred is the first and then the high preferred is the then. If I flip-flop those and say the high preferred first and less preferred then, the motivation to engage in the then or the less preferred after the fact of getting the high preferred is going to be a lot less likely to happen. So again, what you're doing is you're trying to play upon motivation and take advantage of that motivation by saying, hey, I have this thing available, that's the then. First, we're going to do this thing that's less preferred, and then you get access to the higher preferred thing. So shared control is providing options. So what you're doing is you're giving the child or the student a sense of control over the situation or the environment by giving those choices. And what's important though when you utilize or take advantage of shared control is that those options are relatively similar in preference. That example would be, hey, do you want to eat vegetables or do you want to eat dessert? Those aren't really comparable in preference, but it might be, hey, we're going to have vegetables. Do you want to have broccoli or do you want to have asparagus? They might be relatively similar in terms of value of preference, which is likely low, but at least they're relatively equal. Shared control is giving them that sense of control over the environment by providing options that are relatively equal in value. Establishment of a reinforcer is what we're doing is we're taking advantage of motivation here. And so I'm saying, hey, what is it that you want to work for? What do you want to earn? If I can establish that motivation early on by figuring out what is they want to earn and say, hey, no problem, I have that available for you. These are the things now that we need to do in order to get access to that thing that you want. So I'm setting up that motivation early on. That's usually one of the first things we'll do is do a preference assessment, establish that reinforcement based upon that preference assessment, and then take advantage of that motivation and then go from there by then establishing expectation. In terms of teachers, practitioners, psychologists, parents as well, we spoke a little bit about previously, they can all benefit from these, especially if they're utilizing these things with these strategies with children that engage in maladaptive or unwanted behaviors. So oftentimes what we see is that the traditional lines of family members, parents, sometimes even educators or other practitioners will revert to a consequence or a reactive approach when it comes to managing behaviors, more specifically difficult behaviors, even more specifically the use of aversive strategies. So maybe response costs, punishment-based procedures have a lot of negative side effects that come along with them. And what's so great about preventative strategies is that there aren't any negative side effects to them. And what they actually do is that if you can use these low-effort strategies to prevent behaviors from happening, there are no behaviors to necessarily use reactive strategies with. They're relatively low effort in terms of demand required upon a person. And so that's what's so fantastic about them. And I think in terms of motivating parents to use them, I think showing them how low effort they are to utilize and take advantage of and the large impact they can have on the child's behaviors in the future, I think that could often be incentive enough to use them. But I think it's also important to make sure that parents and practitioners and other people in general that are using these sort of strategies are humans also. And so we can still use these sort of strategies with them in terms of establishment of a reinforcer for them to engage in these sorts of low effort strategies. So we can establish a reinforcer with a parent and say, hey, what do I got to do to get you to use these things? And so that way we can kind of go from there, and obviously in a respectful and appropriate way. This preventative approach is the very same conceptual framework that the public health sector utilizes and takes advantage of. Similarly with dentistry takes this very same approach. It'll tell you to brush your teeth 2 minutes a day, twice a day, use mouthwash, floss your teeth, and same sort of reason is because if you don't use those low effort strategies to brush your teeth and mouthwash and floss, there are a lot of negative health implications that could have. Cavities, gum disease, tooth rot, and then the consequence strategies for those things are relatively complex. Root canals, fillings, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're relatively painful too. I don't think people typically enjoy getting root canals and teeth pulled and whatnot. The reactive strategies and approaches to both of those sectors are relatively complex and not very painless. They're relatively painful as opposed to the preventative strategies. And so if you can employ a preventative approach and keep behaviors from happening, you're a lot more likely to have positive side effects as opposed to relying solely upon an aversive strategy or a punishment-based approach. But that does come along with a lot of negative side effects. I think that it's kind of ingrained in us in society, whether we know it or not. It's the sort of strategy, that sort of aversive, fear-based, consequence-based, reactive approach is what has been thrust upon us growing up in at least in the United States. Let's say like police officers and basic law enforcement. As far as I know, there's not a lot of preventative strategies taken that are enforced. And so there is no form or schedule of reinforcement outside of negative reinforcement for following the speed limit. But if you break the speed limit, there are a lot of negative side effects to that because you can get a ticket. And then there's a lot of negative side effects that come along with that in terms of conditioning versus stimuli as the police officers and so on and so forth. And then you view police officers in a negative light, but there's not a lot of that preventative approach that's been kind of promoted early on. And so it's nice to see that there's a lot of great research out there that shows the positive implications that these sort of preventative low effort strategies can have on the children that we work with. I wish they were more fluently used upon us in society. So if anyone has any other questions about preventative strategies or antecedent-based interventions, feel free to visit my website at bestadaca.com. That's bestadaca.com. And if anyone has any questions about mental health or behavioral health, feel free to reach out to Therapists in Action.